I have lived long enough to know that opportunities must be seized or they will be lost.
Hello and welcome back to Wall Street Radio. I'm your host, Tanner Yarton, here with Dan Young. It's the 3rd of March, 2025. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about the strategic Bitcoin reserve, which was announced over the weekend by the Trump administration. We're going to talk about supply side versus demand side economics and kind of the general strategy that the current administration is taking moving forward with the United States economy. We're going to talk about Zelenskyy going to NATO without the United States after the meeting that happened last week, which some deem to have not gone very well, and all the impacts that it may have on the conflict that's ongoing between Russia and Ukraine right now. In addition to that, we're going to cover astronauts stuck in space with Elon Musk going to save them in a couple of weeks. I say save them very lightly, but it's the truth of the matter. They're stuck up there and they're going to come back. So enjoy. Yeah, so obviously last week we saw a majority of the markets get sold off pretty heavily, especially crypto, with Bitcoin leading the charge, just getting absolutely slammed into the end of the week. And then over the weekend, we get the announcement of a strategic crypto reserve for the United States. So I think that outlines a very crucial point about Trump's strategy here and how closely tied he really is to the markets. Just like his first term, when things were going wrong, he would make just the right announcement to turn things around. And I think the announcement of the strategic Bitcoin reserve as Bitcoin is selling off heavily that's classic Trump. And I think we should anticipate that to continue, not only in crypto markets, but also in traditional markets.
Yeah, it is the ultimate Trump play there. I don't understand it though. Again, I'm not the biggest crypto guy in the world, but I do remember watching Zeitgeist in high school. I do remember the problem with the Federal Reserve and the whole implementation and like creation of Bitcoin. I thought, as someone who went to college in like the later 2000s, like 2010, it was around that huge crypto wave when it first started to reach the surface. The Zeitgeist movies had just come out. I just thought the whole thing was supposed to replace the dollar because it's not regulated by government and it can't, the supply cannot be controlled. I thought that was the premise. Am I missing something?
No, I think, the nice thing about Bitcoin that people like it for is the fact that you can't make more coins. Like there will be 21 million coins and that's it. And the majority of those coins are lost to forever because of the way that passwords work on crypto wallets. You have to remember a certain key phrase, which is a series of words. And if you lose that, you can't get into the account. There's no forgot password, email me a reset code with Bitcoin. So people really like it for that reason. But yeah, United States participation, if Bitcoin becomes something more, the United States creating a strategic reserve and really hoarding a large portion of the supply is absolutely going to have an impact down the road. Right now, that's not clear because Bitcoin, as it stands, is not super useful unless you're in a country that has an extremely volatile currency and you kind of need to put your money into something that's not your own currency, just in fear of it getting inflated out the wazoo. So, yeah, I don't think you're missing anything necessarily, but it's also worth remembering that the United States, whether or not something is a good idea or not in the short term, we tend to want to put ourselves at the forefront of any innovation or development in what's popular, simply because throughout history, it's been more beneficial to be wrong, but do it anyway than to not do it and be wrong, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I would leave this to the listeners as well. If you consider yourself a cryptocurrency guru, someone who really understands and can like come back at these premises and these questions that I have, I'm the first to say that there's a lot that I don't know about crypto. So I'm just speaking from the general like idea that I have of it and the creation of it and really what the attractiveness is to me. Even though I never buy it, like I could see how someone would want to invest in a deregulated currency. Like that makes a lot of sense. That could be obviously used internationally. There's very limited boundaries to it. Like, I get all that, but if there's more to this that I'm like missing the big picture, I do invite those guest members and those listeners to either come on the pod and like talk to us about it and inform us, or send in notes to the pod and just let us know like what your thoughts are, because this is something that to me seems really black and white, where the US government already owns 208,000 Bitcoin. So like I think the last time I checked, it was like 17 or 18 billion in Bitcoin. I just don't really understand how, if they're going to control a large portion of it, it could ever be deemed something different than the dollar. Like, it's supposed, the closer for me, it's like the closer Bitcoin comes to the US government or to any like institution, it's just going to be closer to the dollar. And the whole point is to separate the dollar and Bitcoin. And I just find it a little odd. And this happens, right? I did want to say this. This happens a lot with, whether it's throughout history, it doesn't have to do with like any type of crypto, but any type of theme or movement or idea. I think the idea is the thing I'm looking for, that becomes very taken up by a national audience. And the larger it becomes, it starts to lose its identity and purpose a little bit. We see that. I mean, that's a classic old story time and time again. Like, an idea starts small, it has good intentions, it then works its way larger and larger. And by the time it gets so large, it loses the root, because it goes to so many different principles and ideas and different people who have different ideas about what it is. And all of this saying that Bitcoin started as something, right? The Bitcoin that started as something 20 plus years ago is much different than the thing today. And I just find it weirdly convenient, but also really important to know that there's crypto enthusiasts who are really excited about this the strategic reserve that they're going to have in Bitcoin, where, in my opinion, the early day crypto people would hate this, because it'd be very anti what the point is. So it's, they're using it as a convenience now. And it boosts the stock price up over the weekend tremendously. It like saved it from crashing potentially much further. I just think it's interesting to be liking something that goes against the principle of what it is for the convenience of a share price increase. But crypto, to me, the whole point of crypto, the backbone, because at the end of the day, show me value. There is no value in crypto unless it is, in my opinion, there's no value in crypto unless it is backed by a US entity or like a US institution. But also, in doing that, it breaks the premise of crypto, like from a fundamental foundational standpoint. So it's these two conflicting, opposing things in my perspective. I don't think I'm way off, but I could be.
Yeah, as Americans, it's difficult. And we talked about this on an earlier podcast. As Americans, it's difficult for us to recognize that there are a lot of people around the world who don't even feel safe keeping their wages in the currency of their country. So they use Bitcoin and cryptocurrency to kind of save themselves from getting hyperinflated by maybe a mismanaged or corrupt government. That being said, though, you're correct in the sense that in recent times, the more that crypto and especially Bitcoin, with all the ETFs and now this reserve, as we shift more towards things like that or products like that, Bitcoin itself becomes closer and closer correlated to the actual market itself. And, you go back 10 years and the idea was, oh, this is an inflation hedge. Well, if we look at a correlation coefficient between Bitcoin and SPY or some of the other main indexes, and you extrapolate it out over the course of Bitcoin's history, you could see that in the early days, that was the case. You didn't really have any correlation between Bitcoin and the stock market, whereas now it's very closely correlated. For those of you who don't know, the correlation coefficient basically just measures it measures the relationship between two variables and how closely they are, how closely they move together directionally. So, the closer to 1 you are, the more correlated they are. 0 is not correlated, and then -1 is opposite. So when one goes up, the other one goes down. And over the last 10 years or so, we've gone from almost having no correlation in Bitcoin to the broad market to now at this point where it's pinned right under 1. It's at about 0.9. So the correlation is quite heavy between broad markets and Bitcoin itself. And I think that just kind of speaks to the point of like, okay, if you're going to buy something under the premise that it's going to save you from inflation or save you from the wrongdoings of traditional markets, it's worth recognizing that the asset that you've chosen is now very closely correlated with broad markets.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And to me, it just further exemplifies the large discrepancy that I have, at least from where Bitcoin was 15 years ago, 20 years ago to where it is today. And it's just funny that now Bitcoin is dependent on the thing that it was created to get away from, right? Like
Yeah,
that, that's
I
it. That's
agree.
really it's interesting. It's just like kind of it's not, I'm not saying it's good. I'm not saying it's bad, because at the end of the day, I wouldn't value crypto at all unless it was backed by an institution like the US government. So like to me, this is actually more bullish. Like this gets me personally more interested in investing in something like a crypto. But at the end of the day, it also makes me question like, why? Like what is the value? Why not just go to gold at this point? Because that's also, backed by the US dollar. It's just there's a lot of different questions that I have. It's a weird thing where it makes me more attracted to it, but at the same time, it it removes, in my opinion, what little like value it had behind it, which was more of the idea.
Yeah, well, maybe that's the case as well. There's more people like us who are much later to adopting crypto, quote unquote, um, who view it that way, and that's why it's seeing more popularity and obviously increase in price recently. Because there's more people like us who are like, oh, it's there's a little bit more safety behind it in the sense that the government's involved, whereas the original adopters of crypto, are those people getting out and just being replaced by people who are more interested in it because it is closer correlated to the government and their action? I'm not sure. But in any case, strategic reserve announced. I don't know what's going to be in it just yet. I'm sure it's gonna go exactly how Trump's first term went. Whenever he would talk about the market, where he would just start shouting out great companies that were doing phenomenal work. And I would imagine he'll do the same thing with the reserve. He'll be like, "Oh yeah, Cardano, what a coin! We're gonna add this to the reserve," and then the price goes crazy, and we'll see how that turns out. That was always interesting to trade back then during his first term. I obviously don't trade crypto that much, so probably won't be paying too close of attention to it, but it'll be interesting to see if he operates it the same way he did operate the stock market during his first term in presidency.
Yeah, and for me, the more interesting trade would be, okay, if they announce a strategic reserve, what does this not mean for crypto, but the things that have to supply the power to crypto, right? Like that's where my mind would go is crypto is not the trade for me. It's the things that would help support and, push up this trade.
Yeah, exactly. And that goes back to our favorite energy trade.
Yep.
Yeah. Speaking of which, did you see there was somebody had messaged me last night. There was a tornado in Texas right by one of the big crypto miners' operations, and I was thinking about implications of that. If a large mining operation were to be damaged in a natural disaster, what does that look like for that? I mean, that just kind of like wipes out their ability to make money. Obviously,
Oh,
insurance
yeah.
is going to cover it, and down the road that'll come back. But I was trying to think of the last time where a company's physical infrastructure could be wiped out in such a way where it would have drastic impacts on the business itself, especially for some of these smaller crypto miners where that they don't have a ton of warehouses, they don't have a ton of mining operations. They might have one campus or two campuses. So, that trade is one that I haven't really looked into too much, but it did make me think about, okay, if some of these smaller operations get wiped out for one reason or another, like, is there a short trade there? I don't know. But it was a thought I had last night seeing tornadoes in Texas, because I know there's a lot of data centers there, and it's like a hotbed right now for all things mining and AI and training models.
Yeah, it's actually a very interesting premise because Tornado Alley being like Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, like down into like really North Texas. But as you get into North Texas, like there's some serious land there that's been getting bought up recently for some of these things that you're talking about, these projects with semis or different type of energy reserves. Um, it's really interesting. I wonder, we'd have to take a look and see like how many data centers and like what type of property exists in North Texas, Oklahoma, and see if there's a type of trade or like, because at the end of the day, Tornado Valley every time gets slammed. And as that land, all that open land, that's usually just farmland that's getting smoked. If that's now bought up by corporations who are investing dollars in it that then equal, output into a business, that could be something to certainly watch out for.
Yeah, I know the top 3 states right now are Texas, Virginia, and New York. Maybe Florida. I think the top 3 are Texas, Virginia, and New York for data centers and all these models, which kind of surprises me because I would think that the tax savings of being in a state like Texas makes sense. But Virginia and New York, I mean, it's really expensive to operate in New York. So it surprises me that that's one of the top places for data centers or for any kind of operation. I mean, there's a dam that was converted in Niagara Falls into a crypto mining operation here in New York, and that surprises me because I feel like it would just be so expensive to operate here, where you
Yeah.
could find the cheapest land possible and the cheapest energy. But I guess we're closer to the grid in New York, so maybe it's cheaper. I'm not sure.
Yeah, the electric costs, right, is probably playing a pretty big impact on that one. I don't know. I'd have to do a little bit more research into it.
Yeah, there's actually that guy that I sent you on Twitter, that commercial real estate guy. He talks a good bit about like where the ideal data center locations are. And he brought up an interesting tweet, and I tried to find it before we got on today. But he deleted it, which I guess doesn't surprise me. But he was talking about how they're buying up property on the on the east side of mountain ranges because I guess the way that wind goes in the world is mostly west to east.
Mhm.
And he found that he could get electricity costs down if he were buying land on east sides of mountain ranges for some reason. And I wish I could go back and find it, and I'll hope to find it for another episode for us to talk about, but I want to mention it now so I don't forget it. But it was a really interesting play that he was making as a commercial real estate investor of buying data centers along specific geographical features to reduce costs on electricity. And then he said that it didn't matter what state it was in, the cost savings were so great. And usually the communities that were along there were so foreign to this idea of putting data centers in their town that they would get great deals on the land, and then they would save tremendously on the electricity. So
I wa-
it's cool now that we're seeing a whole new trade idea or a whole new kind of innovation in where we're going to put all this stuff and where energy might go. Because right now the hotbeds are obviously the primary cities, but it's like if you can find cheap energy somewhere else in a random town in Minnesota, are we going to see blooming towns or cities in the next 20, 30 years based on
yeah,
that fact?
yeah. Then they'll become ghost cities like China has probably.
Or
Um,
Detroit?
yeah. Well, that's really interesting. I wonder the first two things I could think of are that solar, obviously the use of the wind, I don't think that would be it. The cooling as well, like from a cooling perspective, there's a lot of energy used alone to just cool down the GPUs and processors to make sure they don't overheat. Like just like a car engine, like the radiator is one of the most important things in that engine. So like from a cooling perspective, if you're capturing winds constantly going west to east instead of having to like manually power and create those, that could probably save a lot of money. Like fans or something like that. That's really interesting though. I'd be interested to learn more.
Yeah, I couldn't find. He posted it. He's like, "Yeah, I've got this analyst who's real smart, and he came up with this idea." And then I saw that tweet. That this tweet had to have been months ago at this point, but I've always thought about it because I was like, "What a cool idea!" And then I went back to find it to show you, and it was deleted. And now I can't find any more information on this. So either I'm gonna have to go in and do the research to figure out what kind of geography is most opportune for data centers and warehouses, but an interesting concept nonetheless. And it's going to open a lot of opportunity, I would imagine, for maybe some cities that aren't super popular right now, but might be, especially if Trump starts putting some stimulus on infrastructure around the United States. Maybe some cities that haven't been doing so hot lately are maybe going to come back into the thick of it, and that would obviously increase real estate purchases there, building, new development, and maybe restart some of those economies.
Yeah, you combine that too with the article last week about infrastructure. Imagine if one of these towns or cities is also on the rail line for like a high speed train that connects major cities, like a Atlanta to Charlotte or Charlotte to DC. If you're like a Raleigh or a Richmond, for example, connecting Greensboro, like some of these ones that kind of exist in between major cities that could be a hub or a passing point for high speed rail that could also attract a lot of attention. So that's a nice like speculation type of idea that, we should probably carve out a little bit as well.
Yeah, that's what I was saying about some of the research that we've been doing lately is it. There's obviously the core idea of the articles, but then, now that they're published, we go back and look at them periodically and more ideas come to us. And it opens up the door for a lot of opportunity, which is great. And it's the infrastructure trade is so cool to me because it's such a slow moving industry that when opportunity comes to it, it comes fast, and that to me is cool. Like I think we've talked about this before. When energy comes into rotation, it's like basically just a straight up line for like months with
Yeah.
no real pullback. And I think an infrastructure trade would be very similar in that way, where when this stuff starts coming, it's just gonna go with all gas and no brakes.
Yeah. I mean, for Trump to get there, one of the things we wanted to talk about today was like his supply side economics and the
Yeah.
way in which he goes about that. Obviously, like in order to achieve a lot of his infrastructure, these ideas of major cities blossoming again, like point one is how do you go about it? Um, the one thing he's, always pushed his supply side, I will say, that is very much in tune with lower regulation. However, like I will say it's, and again, we say this all the time on the podcast. So we said this previously, but Doge as a department has kind of been overseeing a lot of different things, and the government has gotten bigger, in my opinion. And maybe, right, and maybe things have to get bigger for it to be smaller, which does make sense. Like sometimes you have to increase the microscope to then be able to let things function independently, making sure that there's nothing actually within it that's causing barriers to that independent movement. Like that makes a lot of sense to me. But it is interesting, as like one of the core principles of that supply side economics is more of like the lesser government interference. And it brings up a big question for me, which I have conversations with my parents and other people about all the time, which is, Reagan was obviously very big on this idea as well. The big problem that a lot of people see in the United States is the taxes, and specifically the tax bracket and how billionaires rarely pay what they're supposed to, right? Generally speaking, if you were to tax the billionaires as much as we probably should tax them, they would make up a lot of the debt. And so that's like, a big circling compass around why people liked Reagan and why people did not like Reagan. It's kind of like, you know, it's kind of split, to be honest, depending on who you speak to, because they either love the fact that he had this supply side economic push, or you hate the fact that he pretty much he pretty much put into place trickle down economics, which let billionaires get away with making more money. And the taxes, in my opinion, they don't work today. Should there be no income tax? I mean, that would be fantastic. But at the same time, I don't know if that's possible without reducing the debt. I know Trump and Musk think it's possible. That's kind of like a wait and see. For me, it's like, okay, but what does that mean, right? Because tariffs and taxes on the other countries are going into place tomorrow, I believe. Like, what does that mean for our spending dollar? Does the power of our dollar go up or down? Am I going to be paying $15 for eggs next week if I can even find them at the supermarket? So, like, could we reduce the debt and like get back to a healthy state? Yes. How much will be paid by the common person versus the billionaire? That's my concern.
Yeah, and for those of you who don't know, what we're discussing here is supply side versus demand side economics. So normally, a more democratic president or administration, they're going to stimulate the economy by creating more programs to help the consumers themselves, whereas Republicans, generally speaking, are more in the business of encouraging increased production on the business side, cutting taxes and corporate and giving corporations more kind of rope to do as they please to increase to increase production. And then, like you said, that's that trickle down economics. And Trump is absolutely on the side of supply side, or that trickle down effect. And, it's worked in the past. Both sides have worked in the past. That's a key thing to point out. One is not necessarily so much better than the other because it is very situational. And it's interesting to see so much supply side discussion in a period of time where he's trying to reverse what essentially was a ton of supply side economics through COVID. So it's like his idea is to cut government spending, but one of his main ways to move the market, and which is again what he's closely tied to, is to do it through QE. So it's like it's weird. It confuses me slightly in the sense that, okay, your idea is to cut government spending, but by doing so, you're going to launch a strategic Bitcoin reserve and probably stimulate infrastructure in the event of economic downturn to push the market. It's like, I don't know. You hope that the savings will outweigh whatever that spending may be down the road.
Yeah, I mean, that's the question, right? What is the cost? Yeah. And for me, does someone like Elon or Jeff Bezos, I was at dinner the other night and we looked it up because I was curious. It was like an hour-long dinner. We were talking about this entire policy, which is like trickle-down economics, the taxes in the country, like what we all thought. And we looked it up, and I think it was Jeff Bezos made, oh man, now I'm going to butcher it. I'll look it up by the end of the pod. But the amount of money that he was making, I think the way we did it was like the amount of money he made that day alone. It was a Saturday, so a non-working day. The amount of money he made that day alone, based off his equity interest in Amazon, was more than like everyone's generation at the table would ever make in their lifetime, because it's that much money. Yeah. And I don't think people really understand the difference between a millionaire and a billionaire. Like it's much, much different. So for me, and I am like one of the first people to be like capitalistic. Like I believe in a capitalistic society. I believe that the hardest working deserve to be like the most compensated, that, what you put in should equal what you put out. And I'm fully all for that. I just think it's a crime that someone like me, for example, from an income perspective, like I'm paying 4% less than Elon Musk. And that's a fact based off federal regulation. So, and that's even if he's paying his taxes, which, there's also been misreports about how much does Elon actually pay. And I'm not here to rag on Elon. I'm just saying the point here is that if someone like me who makes, astronomically way less than Elon Musk has to pay only 4% less in taxes federally, that seems like a pretty big miss. That could just be me personally, but to the common person, like if you're able to like make a million X or a billion X someone's salary in a year, but only 4%, it's like, what am I missing here?
Yeah, I think a point that gets brought up most commonly when somebody talks about the difference in taxes between the huge earners and the smaller earners, and I think there is a happy medium somewhere in there. But one thing that I've always thought is you need to have focused wealth to have widespread innovation, right? If you look at countries that tax heavily, and yeah, they have great services for their citizens, but if you look at the countries that tax most heavily, they're not innovating. They're not creating businesses that are pushing humanity forward. And having guys like Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, that have a large concentration of wealth, they're able to develop and spend on projects that the government would never spend on, right? If we look back 10 years ago, space was not something that anybody was interested in. I mean, even you go back 15 years, 20 years, space was not something that people were looking to, as taxpayers, were looking to spend money on. But, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos founded Blue Origin and SpaceX. And now suddenly there's a whole lot of interest in the government spending on space exploration. So part of me is like, yeah, absolutely. Maybe these guys could be paying more in taxes, but at the same time, I don't necessarily mind that we have some individuals with a considerable amount of wealth to be able to start companies that nobody wants to start and just lose money terribly for a while before anything makes any headway, because somebody's got to do it. And if you have a government that's running perfectly efficient for all of its citizens, in the sense that nobody's going hungry, nobody's going homeless, I think that takes away the opportunity for spend on things like that, where you are just losing money in the pursuit of pushing humanity forward. So there's two sides to that coin. I honestly don't mind it at all. I don't really care to pocket watch the big dogs, but it's worth noting that there is a happy medium somewhere in there as far as what taxes are for some of these larger players. That being said, I do want to take a page, since you brought it up, the difference between a millionaire and a billionaire. Have you seen the Rogan segment where they talk about if a dollar was a second, how much time is a million seconds?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
11 days.
11 days. And then
Yeah.
how long is a billion seconds, assuming $1 billion at
Isn't
1
it,
second?
isn't it like 32 years? 31, something like that?
Yeah, it's 31 years. So the acceleration of wealth from $1 million to $1 billion to $1 trillion is astronomical.
Yeah.
Is absolutely astronomical. But another thing too that I get DMs about sometimes, or people will comment on when we talk about wealth at today's standing, is, okay, these people have a lot of money now, but inflation is obviously ramped up over the last 100 years, especially when you consider that it accelerates over time. And if you adjust the amount of money that the wealthiest people have now, and you go back to early 1900s, even the late 1800s, and then you adjust that for the size of the economy at those times as well, it's actually fairly close. Rockefeller at his peak had $525 billion adjusted for economic size and inflation today. So people have more money now than they ever have before, in the sense that that's in today's dollars. But if you adjust it back for the economy of the time and also inflation at the time, people have had just as much wealth as they have now throughout history. It's just been in different values because of different economic standings of our country at the time.
Yeah, that's true. But also, one thing about like the space thing you brought up, like space has always been an interest. It was a really large interest in the US throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, like landing on the moon, making all these operations. Like it had a lot of momentum. The problem is it just didn't get a lot of government funding later in the years. And for me, it's like, do I really care that like Bezos has Blue Origin? No. That's just a project that someone has when they have too much money. Like I don't think there's any, in my opinion, I don't think there's any like grander value for him having that. That's like, I want to go explore space. I think that's just someone who has a fuck ton of money, and he's sending Lauren Sanchez up there, like the chick who wore like a bra to the inauguration. So, for me, it's like I don't really care that much. And this is someone who went into college and got into aerospace engineering in college because they wanted to work for NASA. Like that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a rocket scientist. And then when I was going through college, NASA got defunded significantly. And so jobs were bleak, it was dismal. And so I pivoted my career at that time. So that's just like, this is someone who has an admiration and a likening for space and space exploration, and I'm all for it. But do I think like Jeff Bezos really cares? No, I don't. I just think he has a ton of money. And if I had as much money as he has, and he's making I looked it up, 85 million a day, whether it's a weekend or a work day, he's making 85 million. Like, what are you going to do with all that money? I would do the same thing, even if I didn't care. Like, I would do things I don't really care about just because I have the money. So again, like I'm for space exploration. I'm for people who put themselves in these positions and work as hard as they do to have a lot of money. But at some point, there is a waste for sure. Like there's a lot of stuff that Elon or Jeff or anyone else has that they really don't need. And the discrepancy between the low class, the middle class, and the upper echelon of the 1% and the one of 1%, it is growing astronomically because those people who are making all this money have it invested in the markets, right? They're able to take advantage of compound interest. And that goes back to probably like an education conversation that should be had, which you showed me that stat a couple weeks ago, which really solidified something I already knew. But when you look at class discrepancy, the amount of people in the upper class versus the lower class and the amount that invest actively into the market or into an ETF versus those that don't, it's a direct correlation. So there's obviously like an education problem in the country with that, which we know about, but I just don't know if someone should be making 85 million a day and then get to take home, right, 4% less than someone who, I think the cutoff was like, I mean, the cutoff's pretty drastic. It goes from like, I think it was like 180 to 240 and then like 240 to 500. And then like, as soon as you make more than like 5 or 600 million or 600,000, like you're pretty much at the top rate. Like, I just think the rate cuts off way too soon, in my opinion. I have no problem with them having as much money as they deserve, but at the same time, like, it just feels weird that a majority of the payback to the government sits within the lower and middle class. Like, that's a fact. Like, it does. So again, like, it's a dilemma. It's certainly a dilemma that we have faced for the past 35, 30 years in the country, and our debt has been growing substantially. Obviously, like, economically, corporations are flourishing, like, we're doing okay, but it is a very interesting question that this administration is going to have to face because they are very commercial and corporate friendly. And the longer you do that, and the longer you line the pockets of big tech and of these billionaires, you move. Listen, I am an American first. I believe in obviously like everything constitutionally, but I will say the more you line the pockets of corporations and billionaires, the more you start to look like an oligarchy. And I'm not saying you are. I'm not saying we are one bit. I'm just saying perception is the most important thing when it comes to politics. And when you cater things that align the pockets of people already who have a ton of money, it becomes a little questionable. Like, this wasn't really on the agenda today, but I guess it probably is because we're going to talk about Zelenskyy soon and like that whole fallout. But I think Trump has to be really careful here. He is pointing and shooting, and there's not really much aim involved in what he's doing, which we all knew he had to do within the first 2 years because of the time gap between the next election and what could really lose the shift of power for the Republicans. But in doing that, he just needs to be careful because he's doing some stuff that is like very borderline impeachment worthy. Just because he could lose the support on the Republican side, in my opinion, if he continues to kind of cater to the Elons of the world and stop listening to a lot of the people, like the common people and the middle class, that could bite him in the ass really quick. And this whole NATO conversation and the Ukraine conversation that happened this weekend, I mean, talk about like another really volatile situation to be in for the president, not just from like a legislation perspective, but think about the optics and how really, honestly, how bad the optics were on that. What are you thinking in terms of like the future forward with Zelenskyy, Ukraine, but also how close Trump is, walking this gray line between doing what he needs to do, but also like inducing a lot of risk on himself to even be in the seat to do it.
Yeah, I mean, part of me wants to be more positive outlooked in the sense that there is a plan here. And while it does feel like blind firing, at the current moment, I think about this idea of this infrastructure trade, and that to me is like that to me would be so great. And again, I'd like to assume that he has his hands on the wheel in that regard, where if things do go poorly in the short term, he'll be able to pull us out via infrastructure spending, which will bring a lot of jobs and just boost the United States as a whole, which I think is great for the middle class and the common consumer. As far as what's going on with Zelenskyy, obviously last week we saw and talked about that meeting that went down, and now we're seeing Zelenskyy go to the other members of NATO without us, and people on social media, especially Twitter, are calling it like the world is moving on without the United States. That to me is a little that's a little bit of an oversimplification. I think we are NATO at the end of the day as far as spending is concerned. So I think the Zelenskyy going to the rest of Western Europe for help it's like a photo op more than anything. I mean, I think the UK signed for $3 billion to help Ukraine. I mean, we spent that in a week last year.
Yeah.
So I don't necessarily think that ends I don't think that goes to a situation where the United States is just not in the picture for that conflict anymore. Like, I don't think this is the end of the United States conflict in Ukraine and Russia. I think that deal will come back to the United States, and we'll end up working it out because, again, we've got the biggest pocket to do it, and those Western countries in Europe just can't do it without us. I don't think.
Yeah, that's fair. For me, it's just about, as someone who, when I worked at Bloomberg, for example, half the game was politics, right? And the optics of it. And especially, being in DC and what I was overseeing, which was the government division of the business unit, like, it wasn't about how well you did or what you did. A lot of it was just what people perceived of how you were doing things, or like their intention behind it. And that's with a business where there's very correlated outcomes of what are your results, what's your revenue. And that's what I always relied on, was the data. Like, how is the business thriving? How are we succeeding? How are we minimizing our risk? With the president, it is so much the opposite, right? Like, you're not really able to show a scorecard at the end of the month or at the end of the week and say, hey, here's what we did. Like, you can, that they're trying to do with Elon, for example, but that doesn't really matter as much as like what the interview was with Zelenskyy. Or it really takes one bad situation or one bad interview, because the press is always on him, to undo everything he's already done or like trying to do. So intention is one thing. Like, you could have the best intentions in the world to fix the US, to fix the debt, to do all these things, but you have to also at the same time understand the delicate balance of optics. And you're not going to be able to change the political atmosphere in which that operates in just 2 months. He's barely been in seat now for the second term for 6 weeks. I think we've seen a lot of volatility already. And what I would like to see personally is a little bit more stability and conscientiousness about what he says, what he does. Like, I don't think the Zelensky interview should have been live. I don't think that should be public. That's something that they should just handle behind closed doors, because for him, again, if optics matter that much, like, you're just really dividing the country, and we need to stop dividing. Like, doing stuff like this is only going to create opposing views on different platforms and people going head to head and toe to toe on different things. Like, I'm for Ukraine. I'm not. I think, Zelensky is corrupt. I don't. I think Trump is corrupt. Like, you can't put this type of divisive stuff publicly available to the US, in my opinion, at the state that we're currently in, because we are already divided. And so it's like those small decisions, right, that I want to see cleaned up. And we'll see what the outcome is at the end of the day. I think there's a lot of good things that could happen. I'm just kind of concerned that the ego, right, the ego of it will kind of take away from the prosperity of the idea.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons why we're getting this kind of display so early on in Trump's presidency is because he knows he has full control over the United States government at the current moment. So, in 2016, he's walking on eggshells, whereas now he's got full control. So I think he's a lot more cavalier with how he talks and what he airs and what he does, because he knows that unless he loses the Republicans in these in these governing bodies, he can pretty much say whatever he wants and have no repercussions on it at all. That's obviously not a great thing, but it is the truth.
Yeah, definitely. It's just something that we're going to have to be able to see as the time goes on, like how it eventually unfolds. And listen, he's got now, I mean, time is ticking, so I definitely understand the months go by pretty quickly here, and sooner or later he's going to more than likely at this pace lose the domination that he has within the branches at the moment. But we're going to see how that shifts, and I think we're going to see some pretty volatile summer action, in my opinion. Like, that's when a bulk of this is going to get done, is between those months of May to August, when generally the government slows down a lot. That's when there's going to be a full press, I believe. And so, was there anything else you want to talk about today?
Yeah, I mean, geez, I feel like the last few episodes we've been drilling. It's been Armageddon left and right, but there is one nice little piece to kind of to top us off here. In 2 weeks, Elon is going to go up and get those astronauts that have been stuck in space for quite some time and bring them back via SpaceX. So pretty cool piece of news there. They had originally gone up for 8 days, and then NASA, different media outlets will say different things, but NASA abandoned them up in space. So it's kind of cool that he's going to go up and grab them with SpaceX. And I don't know, to me, like, that's sweet. Like, I obviously like Elon Musk, but just, I like that the government can be reliant on a private company to get something done that needs to be done.
Yeah, that's super.
That to me is great.
Yeah, it's a feel-good story for sure. I mean, I can't imagine ever going up into space. I think that's something I'm like mentally not even close to being able to do ever. We'd have to have like really legitimate, honestly, like flying rocket ships at that point that I feel comfortable even driving myself. It's just space is one of the scariest things in the world to me. And that's someone who does like love it and have a passion for it. I just also admire, it's like the ocean. Like every time I go to the ocean, I love being on the coast, but it's also that respect, that like deep respect that you have of something like that, like space or like the ocean, which is so powerful and so unknown and so dark. And it's just like one of those things. But I can't imagine going up and being like, yeah, you're going to be up for a week. And then being like, yeah, you're actually trapped up there. It's going to be probably a couple months. Like that mentally, that would be such a shock. But I think that's also the attraction. I kind of wanted to segue, probably end it off around here, but the attraction of something like SpaceX, right? We're a private corporation that can do things that we need them to do. Say we have like a comet or an asteroid headed towards the US, which they always say we do. But in the future, what if there's one that like really impedes with the viability and the life on Earth? That's something that we could hire a private contractor like SpaceX, which uses, high demand technology and like smart minds to kind of combat. It's the same why there's a lot of attraction for companies like Anduril, right? Like Anduril presents that same opportunity where the US, if they have a very specific problem that they need fixed, they can go to one of these private companies that will probably be able to fulfill it because they're fast, they grow fast, they have really like smart minds that work for them. It's much different than the normal government contractor, like a government-based entity. So we probably will see a lot more of those pop up in the future, which is like more highly flexible, adaptable government contractors that have that Silicon Valley energy, which I would say a SpaceX or an Anduril has behind it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole other conversation for another time, but Anduril is one of my favorites right now because their whole premise is right now the Department of Defense says, hey, we want something. Here's a blank check. Go build it. And that obviously, that culminates into a ton of spending, whereas Anduril comes in and says, hey, we're building this. If you want it, you can buy it. And I think that does two things. Number one, it allows the innovative minds to actually innovate and make stuff that that is pushing forward. Because if the contractor, if the Department of Defense is saying, hey, we want to build something, the idea is only as good as that person is smart. Whereas at Anduril, where the actual smart minds are working on the products, they can push the envelope further and then bring those to the Department of Defense and say, hey, here's what we've made. If you want to buy it, we think it'll be good in these departments and for these reasons. And I like that a lot more than the kind of, we want to build this, do what you can to do it. I think, number one, it'll save on spending. And two, it will allow the innovative minds to actually innovate instead of just having to work on, what the government might want, which in my opinion has been pretty outdated. I mean, we're still using technology that's decades old on the front lines in the field. Whereas in conflicts around the world, we're seeing new technologies that are being made in somebody's garage.
Yeah, that is the American dream, in my opinion, is like creativity, innovation, fast paced, fast moving, getting away with the old and the tired and like moving forward with something that could really turn, what we're living in on Earth, like into that next advancement. That's what we do as a society. We continually improve and we try to build the newest thing. I think we kind of got into a little rut for the past 30, 40 years where we were doing that in little pockets. Like, for example, Apple, I think, was one of the biggest breakthroughs, obviously, not just because of the iPhone and what it did, but it really took upon itself after the dot-com bubble to be like, we're going to continue advancing and pushing the envelope of what consumers want, or like really like what they're going to want without knowing they're going to want it. And that, that's something I'm looking forward to. But let's save that probably for another pod.
Yep. And now Tim Cook releases the same phone every year.
Yeah. Well, Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs is a legend, but he's Tim Cook is no Steve Jobs.
Yeah, but yeah, I think that's a good point to wrap it up. And we really went on a run there for a little while, but we'll have to continue this conversation later this week because we have a lot to talk about, especially when it comes down to some of those more innovative technologies that are coming out. I think their place in the world is coming fast, and it's interesting to talk about. So yeah, if you enjoyed, leave us a follow, leave us a rating. Follow us on Twitter at Tanner's Trades, at the Clam Shanks for both of us, or at Wall Street Radio. We are now live on Substack. If you're listening to this on Substack, thank you for listening there. But now, if you read the newsletter and you don't want to go to a different streaming platform to listen to the podcast, you can now listen to it right on Substack as well. So definitely check that out if that's easier for you. But yeah, that's where I leave you. Goodbye.
Now watch this drive.